Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, Sans co-host today, but we have three brilliant guests on three massive stories. First, I'll speak to Omar H. Rahman from the Middle East Council on Global Affairs on Trump's war with his own intelligence apparatus. Was Iran's nuclear capability destroyed or not? Lots of ambiguity. Disability policy researcher Anna Landre joins me next. We spoke earlier, in fact, about Keir Starmer's welfare cuts and a massive revolt inside the Labour Party. There's even discussions that Keir Starmer could fall. MPs saying if they bring about a leadership election, that's fine with them. Finally, I'm sure you wanted to know about this today. I will end the show by speaking to Waleed Shahid on how Zohran Mamdani beat Andrew Cuomo in the New York mayoral race. Pretty inspiring story. We'll be showing you some clips of Mamdani. Very, very impressive politician. Do stay tuned for all of that. And before we get going though, thank you to everyone who has signed up to become a regular supporter of our work over the past few weeks. This is a really critical time for our work, and we cannot thank you enough for making it all possible. If you're new and would like to sign up to become a supporter, along with the, I think we're almost at 2,000 having signed up over the last couple of weeks. If you would like to join them, you know where to go, novaramedia.com/support. As ever, also, make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat, or you can tweet us on the hashtag NovaraLive. After the American and Israeli war on Iran came to a pause, a new war has broken out. But this time it has different players. It's not between countries or states, but rather Donald Trump and America's military intelligence community. And the war of words began with this exclusive report from CNN last night.
Based on a battle damage assessment that was carried out by U.S. Central Command, essentially looking at the images and looking at what was actually damaged, the Defense Intelligence Agency has assessed that the core components of Iran's nuclear program are largely intact, and that Iran's nuclear program has essentially only been set back by months. Now, we presented this information to the White House for comment, and White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt, she did acknowledge the existence of this assessment, but she said in a statement that the administration disagrees with it. She said, quote, "This alleged assessment is flat out wrong and was classified as top secret, but was still leaked to CNN by an anonymous low-level loser in the intelligence community. The leaking of this alleged assessment is a clear attempt to demean President Trump and discredit the brave fighter pilots who conducted a perfectly executed mission to obliterate Iran's nuclear program. Everyone knows what happens when you drop 14 30,000-pound bombs perfectly on their targets, total obliteration."
So the first intelligence reports from the United States say the strikes over the weekend only caused limited damage to Iran's nuclear capabilities, just setting them back months. But Trump's press secretary doubled down, as you saw there, on Trump's initial claim that the US attacks had obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities. And today at a NATO summit, Donald Trump went on the offensive.
We had a tremendous success, and this is the New York Times. I call it the failing New York Times. It's going to hell. And CNN, which, as you know, very few people are watching. And you would think they'd do the opposite. You would think they'd want to say, this was an unbelievable success. And the thing that hurts me is it's really demeaning to the pilots and the people that put that whole thing together, the generals. That was a perfect operation.
So Donald Trump disagrees with the intelligence report that said the nuclear program was put back by only months. So how long did he think their program had been pushed back?
I think basically decades, because I don't think they'll ever do it again. I just don't think they're going to do it. I think they're going to take their oil, they're going to have some missiles, and they'll have some defense. I think they've had it. I mean, they just went through hell. I think they've had it. The last thing they want to do is enrich. They've been trying to do it. By the way, it's hard to enrich. And, you know, when you look at a site like that, very, very hard to build, very, very hard, very expensive. They spent trillions of dollars trying to do this thing, and they didn't come up with it. And we're actually getting along with them very well right now. But had we not succeeded with that hit ended the war. That hit ended the war. I don't want to use an example of Hiroshima. I don't want to use an example of Nagasaki. But that was essentially the same thing. That ended that war. This ended that with the war. If we didn't take that out, they'd be fighting right now.
I'm joined now by Omar H. Rahman, fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us. I suppose to set us off, how are you interpreting these conflicting claims about the damage done by the US to Iran's nuclear sites?
First of all, good to be with you, Michael. It's interesting. Trump loves his narratives, even though often they are very detached from reality. And this is not the first time that he's, been at odds with his national security establishment or the intelligence community. And we saw from March, Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, said that Iran was not pursuing a nuclear weapons program. And then he came out right before bombing Iran and saying, this is flat out wrong. She's wrong. And I think forced her to walk that back in a, Colin Powell style 2003, Iraq war, making the case. So I think Trump is we don't know ultimately what the reality is here. I think maybe the Iranians are the only ones with a real clue. You can look at your satellite images. You can make your assessments based on X, Y, and Z. But we don't know what the truth of the matter is. But Trump, I think, is wedded to the grand narrative he's spun for a number of reasons. I mean, for one, he came out right away and said the nuclear program is totally obliterated. So if he goes back on that, then he's looking foolish and wrong. He's also in that grand narrative, he's the hero president who decisively once and for all took out Iran's nuclear program, right? That no other president had done before them, although they talked about it. And then the third thing I think is, if he walks it back, I mean, there's a huge political implications in it domestically in the United States. He went against his own political ideology, MAGA political ideology, a huge part of his MAGA movement to justify these strikes against Iran as this one-off thing, taken care of, boom, now we got a ceasefire, it's all over. And those people were pushing back saying, you're dragging us into another Middle East war that you promised us you wouldn't do. And if that's wrong, his assessment is wrong, then it opens the door back up. Because if in his words, if Iran can never have a nuclear weapon and that program is not destroyed, then where are we at right now? Does he need to go back in? Does the war restart to prevent Iran from pursuing nuclear weapons? And that pushes him back into confrontation with a huge part of his MAGA movement. And that is, I think, politically dire for him, especially with the slim majorities the Republicans have in both the House and Senate.
And it's a strange position to be in, because if you're someone who doesn't want to see a war with Iran, at this point you want to side with Donald Trump. Because I was going, when I saw this briefing last night from military intelligence saying we think it's only set back Iran's nuclear capacity by a couple of months, my initial suspicion was, is this being briefed by some neocons or some people from the Israel lobby? Because there are, the neocons in Washington, Israel, Netanyahu, they didn't want just a couple of bombs on Iran's nuclear sites. They wanted regime change. And if they can set the public narrative as to say the nuclear threat is still there, then they could potentially push Trump into going back into Iran. And so, I don't really believe Donald Trump, but I'm almost inclined to pretend to believe Donald Trump for the greater good. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, it's certainly a good point. I mean, it's something that I've been thinking about. And he, by the way, has a longer standing grand narrative of his contention with the deep state, who are constantly trying to undermine him. And of course, the CIA and all these intelligence agencies are the deep state that Trump is railing against. So there's that dynamic at play here. But certainly you're right over what the implications are for that. And that's something that the Iranians are thinking of. Do they declare that this was a failure and that their program still exists and force this issue back onto the table geopolitically between the United States, Israel, and Iran? Or do they downplay it and it's quiet, and maybe they pursue the nuclear weapon in secret, or maybe they negotiate out of this what they were trying to do to begin with, the end of sanctions in exchange for the end of a nuclear weapons program, or not the end, but not pursuing one. Sorry.
Let's look at one more assessment on how much damage this could have done. So this is the director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi. He's speaking to Fox News last night.
Well, I think the nuclear program, the Iranian nuclear program, has been set back significantly. When you say years, and I don't know what is your the metric that you want to apply. Now, I don't know. We have to see what they want to do. Are they going to reconstruct what they had? And let's not forget, there are so many interactions here, Martha. If, for example, there is a resumption, as I hope personally, the negotiation with Ambassador Witkoff, where there was an idea that Iran would not be enriching and would perhaps be part of an international consortium. I mean, there were very interesting ideas that were being floated. This is not my thing. This is for the negotiation that is going to take place, I hope, again, as it was, and we would only need to verify it. But it is clear that there is one Iran before June 13, nuclear Iran, and one now, and it's night and day.
So he's saying it's night and day. So he's suggesting that these attacks did make a significant difference, although he still isn't ruling out that Iran could be relatively close to the capacity of having a nuclear weapon. He said, I mean, before sort of America did this bombing, he said they've got no evidence that they want to. I suppose another development related to this, though, is that Iran's parliament has today approved a bill suspending cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. So the Speaker of Iran's parliament said the organization had refused to even appear to condemn the attack on Iran's nuclear facilities by Israel and had thus, quote, put its international credibility up for sale. How should we interpret this? I suppose the statements from the International Atomic Energy Agency and then sort of Iran's reaction to those.
Sure. Again, I don't know what Grossi's basing his assessments on. Have his people on the ground gone to the nuclear sites and and checked on it for themselves? I don't think that's likely the case at this point. But certainly, I think the Iranians are very angry with the IAEA. It's on the table for sure that they would exit the NPT. Now, there are implications to that too. I mean, you can't just be angry at that and exit that. I mean, it demonstrates something to the world, maybe that you want to go pursue a nuclear weapon. So again, it raises the issue back to the table. But certainly, I think that conversation's like alive and well inside of Iran. That despite being part of this treaty, which Israel is not part of. Despite having IAEA inspectors in Iran, despite signing on to the JCPOA, which had the most thorough, inspections of these nuclear facilities in history that any nuclear program has ever been subjected to, and so offering a transparency level that nobody else has had to deal with, that didn't protect Iran, its nuclear program, and then the IAEA did not speak up on their behalf and defend them and condemn this, the strikes that took place. So.
Because, I mean, if you are in the position, so say you're an American security establishment and you're not one of those mad neocons that just wants regime change everywhere, and your real priority is that Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons, this situation kind of seems like the worst of both worlds, because you've attacked the regime, you've attacked the nuclear program, but you haven't destroyed it, and you're also not engaged in any kind of nuclear agreement. So, on the face of it, it seems as if Iran has every incentive in the world to accelerate its nuclear program and still retains much of the capacity to do so. So if the aim from a sort of rational actor in Washington who genuinely cares about nuclear proliferation, if you put yourselves in their shoes, the current situation doesn't seem particularly sustainable.
When are Washington policymakers rational actors? That's the first faulty assumption there. Anyway. Yes, I agree with you. I mean, you would think again that negotiations are the best way out of this. That bombing Iran, and using deception and deceit of the negotiation process in order to allow Israel to first strike against Iran, and then for the U.S. to go in there and bomb Iran is extremely problematic. It undermines U.S. credibility. It undermines trust between the sides, which was already rock bottom anyway. In terms of coming to some type of agreement, especially after Donald Trump himself pulled out of the JCPOA in 2018, which again undermines the credibility and the trust that America in its commitment is worth the ink that's written on the paper. So, there are all kinds of problems with this, but certainly I think going and bombing Iran and using deception to allow the Israelis to get the element of surprise in there and bomb the country is hugely problematic if you want to see that happen. The other side of this coin is, as well as the massive incentive for Iran at this point, feeling extremely vulnerable and insecure to go there and to pursue the bomb if it can, especially in secret. That's very much on the table. I would think if I was an Iranian decision maker, that may be the course of action I would pursue in order to protect myself, because their entire security architecture has been undermined over the past 21 months, whether that's that kind of forward defensive structure of its regional allies that were putting pressure on Israel and American military bases in the region, or having its ballistic missiles. All these kind of things have been severely undermined. Israel was able to go out and wipe its air defenses out and bomb the country, and the U.S. was able to go in there and do what it did. And so Iran is thinking right now, how do we protect ourselves into the future? And that may be through the pursuit of nuclear weapons. So it may have obviously a reverse effect that was intended.
I mean, from my perspective, I think the best case scenario, because Trump did say in that clip, we're getting along with them well now. So talking about Iran. So the best case scenario, working through sort of his psychology, is he now says, we're going to sign a nuclear deal, which is basically the Iran deal that Obama signed, but it's better than Obama's for some reason, which he hasn't yet specified. And the only reason we could get it is because we bombed Fordo. And so if this was just a very long route to going back to Obama's nuclear deal, that to me would seem like the best case scenario. Whether or not we'll get there, I have absolutely no idea.
It's better because it has Trump's signature on it and not Obama's signature. That's
exactly.
Anyway,
but I'm happy to take that hit. If it means that we get the nuclear deal again, put his name on it. Put his face on it. I don't care. I want to talk about Gaza and what the current state of play with Iran means for Gaza. I was reading, I think it was analysis in the New York Times sort of suggesting that this all has played well in Israel for Netanyahu, because this has sort of seen like an effective strategy by him, if what you're interested in is Israeli strength vis-a-vis Iran, and that could give him leeway to bring peace to Gaza, because he would be able to sort of get re-election without Smotrich and Ben Gvir as part of his coalition. I found that a little bit far-fetched, but what's your interpretation of how what we've just seen over the past 2 weeks, and with reference to Israel, Iran, and the USA, will affect the genocide on the people of Gaza?
It's a good question. If it'll have any effect whatsoever, I'm not quite sure yet. I haven't wrapped my head around that aspect of it. I mean, there is an element that I have been saying since October 7, 2023, that Netanyahu has to use war now to redeem himself in the eyes of the Israeli public. And what he's going to try to do, I thought the limits of it maybe, not that this is, is the destruction of Gaza. And this is part of the motivation, the underlying kind of rationale for the genocide that's taking place, that Netanyahu thinks he has the pretext now to liquidate Gaza and the Gaza problem for Israel for all time. And that, in the eyes of the Israeli public, would redeem him. Now, force escalator here, after knocking out Hezbollah and, Syria falling, then, a wider opportunity opens up to now do what they want to do with Iran. And that is an even greater opportunity to, again, have this resounding regional victory. Israel, it becomes the unfettered, uncontested regional hegemon. And that, is a 1967 moment for Israel and for Netanyahu himself, and that redeems himself. So anyway, put that Iran piece aside, because I think nothing really of consequence was ultimately decided or resolved here between Israel and Iran. And that's important, because I think this, if we spoke about the ceasefire and whether it would hold, I would have my questions in the long term. I think in the short term, it'll likely hold, and we could get into that if you want to. But in the long term, I think nothing was ultimately resolved. When it comes to the people of Gaza and what Israel's intentions are here, it is to destroy the Gaza Strip in its entirety and push the people of Gaza out. And for all those who remain or are unable to be pushed out, to kill. I mean, this is a genocidal operation. It's been from the get-go, from day one. And so I don't see how anything that's happening with Iran would affect that. I think Israel has a goal there. It's been pursuing it, and nobody is stopping it. That's the problem. And it is a daily abomination, what's happening in the Gaza Strip.
Let's end by picking up on the point you just sort of made reference to, which is whether this ceasefire will hold. I suppose the doubts I have about this is, I imagine Netanyahu is disappointed that this ceasefire has arisen, because my mental model was that he quite fancied regime change in Iran and the idea of sort of forever weakening Iran as a counterweight in the Middle East. I'm not sure if that's your assessment too, but I mean, what you said, you think the ceasefire will hold in the short term, but not in the long term. Talk us through that.
Yeah, again, I think fundamentally nothing was really resolved. So I think there will be another day maybe where Iran and Israel are fighting again. I don't know when that's going to be. But in the short term, I mean, let's take a look at Iran first. Iran emerges from this conflict debilitated but not defeated. The regime survived; it's intact. It was, hit pretty hard, but ultimately it was fighting a defensive war, and so its objectives here were very narrow, which is again survival and the restoration of deterrence. And I think it was able to restore that deterrence by hitting the Israelis pretty damn hard, enough where I think a ceasefire. The Israelis were willing, maybe under pressure, but willing to call back and agree to a ceasefire because they were being hit pretty hard. And again, it's very difficult to carry on this long range war against Iran for a very long period of time. Now, for the Israelis, I think Netanyahu achieved enough that he can again spin it at home as this major triumph, this major victory, the lion rising and shaking Tehran or whatever, BS comes out of Netanyahu's mouth. But there was enough there in terms of these kind of spectacular military achievements that, he's able to spin it at home. Although I think it's ultimately a hollow victory, because I totally agree with you. The larger aim here, the overt aim was taking out Iran's nuclear program, and we don't even know what the extent of that is. Even the Israelis are questioning what the efficacy of the strikes were. At the same time, I think the less overt goal was regime change, and they were targeting, all the instruments of state that are used to control the population, like police stations and all these type of things, in order to bring that about, and that ultimately failed because the Iranian government remains intact. And so everything that was destroyed can be rebuilt by the Iranians. They can continue to pursue a nuclear weapon should they choose to. They can, and they will, and this will be the Iranian goal of restoring their air defenses, replenishing their ballistic missile stockpiles, and finding kind of this new, again, security architecture that's going to, make them less vulnerable in the region. And so from that longer term standpoint, I don't think the Israelis achieved all that much, but enough where they can come back. This was a very popular war in Israel, and Netanyahu, looks good in front of his population. And so that gives them enough, I think, where they don't need to go immediately back. But again, a lot hinges on what happened to that nuclear program. So in what you were saying earlier, it's kind of beneficial that everybody believes, maybe it is not, but, I'm a follower of the truth, not on narratives that, we hope to be true. So.
I should also clarify, I'm a follower of the truth in case anyone clips me when I say let's just pretend that Donald Trump is correct and suggest that's the journalistic ethics I live by. Omar, thank you so much for joining us. Really insightful stuff.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Prime Minister Keir Starmer is potentially facing a massive backbench rebellion over his government's planned cut to disability benefits. Over 120 Labour MPs have now threatened to reject the bill, with big figures in the party calling on Starmer to pause the legislation or potentially face humiliating defeat in the Commons. The bill contains proposals to restrict eligibility for personal independence payments, or PIP. That's the main disability payment in England, and it's paid out whether or not a person who qualifies is working. If it passes, the welfare bill will also reduce the sickness-related element of universal credit, as the government tries to claw back £5 billion from the welfare bill by 2030. Now, the combined cuts are expected to result in 800,000 people losing their allowances altogether, many of whom need help washing and using the toilet. Now, that's a difficult pill for many in Labour to swallow. And the Rebel MPs are using a piece of parliamentary procedure to try to block a vote on the welfare bill. And they've tabled what's called a reasoned amendment, which, if passed, would force the government to halt the bill while it conducts an impact assessment of the cuts to PIP and sickness-related universal credit. Now, you would imagine that they should have really done the impact assessment themselves, not be forced into doing so. But let's hope the attempt to stop them does succeed. It's worth noting as well, those trying to stop the bill aren't all left-wing MPs. This is not sort of the socialist campaign group against Keir Starmer. He's used to fending them off. This is from a much broader spectrum of the Labour and Parliamentary Party. It was tabled by Meg Hillier. She's chair of the Treasury Select Committee, and it has the backing of 12 other Select Committee chairs. So Labour MPs who command a fair amount of respect, as I say, across the party. Speaking to Times Radio, Labour MP Kat Eccles explained why she was prepared to rebel over the cuts.
We are aware that there are ministers and PPSs who are uneasy about these changes. So I think it's actually much bigger than we imagine.
So enough to stop the government moving forward with it, essentially?
Yeah, but I think I really want to make clear, because I've been quite disappointed with what some of the leading Labour figures have been saying, including Keir Starmer, is suggesting that we are just out and out opposed to reform or opposed to the Green Paper, and that isn't the case at all. We're all clear that there are good elements to the Green Paper, such as getting economically inactive, healthy people into work. But what we cannot stomach is the changes to the PIP scoring criteria and the removal of the universal credit health element for young people. So it's not a case that we want to see it killed altogether. We just want to see the timeline rearranged so that our constituents aren't losing money before there's essential support in place.
Eccles was also asked how far she would go to stop the bill.
Have you been disappointed by the tone of this conversation from those senior people in the Labour Party? Keir Starmer, I mean, Rachel Reeves is coming in for a huge amount of criticism, but there's a suggestion that MPs like you are disloyal. You're putting the Prime Minister under pressure at a time when he's here at the NATO summit. You're doing the wrong thing. They don't like what you're doing, and they're saying, you know, come on, just walk through the voting lobbies. That's what you're here to do. How do you feel about that tone?
I'm really disappointed with it, because what we're hearing them say is that we're completely against reforms, and that is not what we're saying. We're just saying rearrange the timeline. And it's not just a case of walking through a lobby. We are walking through a lobby with the intention of taking money away from our most vulnerable residents with no safety net to catch them. Councils have been hollowed out, our NHS is still struggling, charities have lost funding. So if we don't support them, I really fear for what's going to happen at the other end. We can still make that 5 billion saving if we just rearrange the timeline.
And in a word, would you be prepared to lose the whip over this? If you oppose it, that could happen. Are you prepared for that?
One word, yeah.
In a sign of growing desperation, the FT reports that Labour whips and ministers have been calling MPs, saying that if the bill falls, it will trigger a leadership election. So in other words, the Prime Minister is turning it into a confidence vote. But there are signs that Starmer may have already lost some of that confidence. So as one Labour MP told the FT, quote, "I would be happy to see a leadership contest. I think perhaps it's time for change." This morning, the iPaper's chief political commentator, Kitty Donaldson, posted this. There is widespread speculation in government that Number 10 will pull the entire welfare bill before the end of Wednesday. I suppose we're closing in on the end of Wednesday, and that hasn't happened yet, but whether or not it will survive until next week, that's a different question. Keir Starmer has responded to that rumour from the NATO conference in the Netherlands.
A third of your MPs are opposing your welfare cuts. It leaves you facing an effective confidence vote in your leadership, but a year after delivering a landslide. Does that make you furious?
Well, we need to drive through reform in the welfare system. It's not working for anyone. It's not a confidence vote. It's a vote.
Not.
It's a vote
You
about
don't see
reform.
it like that.
It's about a vote about reform of our welfare system. So we're going to press ahead with these reforms.
Just to be clear, you don't see it as a confidence vote in your leadership, and you are not going to offer concessions. You're pressing on.
We're pressing on with a vote on this because we need to bring about this reform.
Something quite sinister about defending cuts to the disability benefits budget while you've got these soldiers behind polishing their guns. Rather strange. Some have seen Starmer's tricky position as an indictment of his political instincts. So writing in the New Statesman, Andrew Marr said this. Even natural supporters of Starmer ask whether there is a private Number 10 room in which a genuinely political conversation is taking place. They conclude it doesn't exist, that the Prime Minister surrounds himself instead with civil servants, his comfort zone. To be part of this government is becoming a lonely experience. So lots of people seem to be suggesting Keir Starmer might have his days numbered. At the NATO conference, Starmer was asked by a journalist why he'd failed so miserably to read the political room. This was his pretty prickly answer.
If I may say so, many people predicted before the election that we couldn't read the room. We hadn't got the politics right, and we wouldn't win an election after 2019 because we lost so badly. That was the constant charge at me at press conferences like this, and we got a landslide victory. So I'm comfortable with reading the room and delivering the change the country needs. We've got a strong Labour government with a huge majority to deliver on our manifesto commitments. And that's the work that we did over many years to win the election. Now we start the work over many years to change the country. Having changed the party, we now change the country. And is it tough going? Are there plenty of people and noises off? Yes, of course. There always are, there always have been, there always will be. But the important thing is to focus on the change that we want to bring about.
So when the dispute is about whether or not you're taking money from disabled people who are unable to wash the bottom half of their bodies and who are reasonably upset that you're taking the money away from them, that they need to live their lives normally, to sort of say these are the people sounding off with a little smile on your face seems a little bit inappropriate. That's the politics, though. What about the substance of the dispute? That's what really matters. How will disabled people be impacted if Starmer does get what he wants and if his welfare bill does go ahead? Well, to find out the answer to that question, I spoke earlier to Anna Landre, a researcher in disability policy at UCL and a wheelchair user herself.
So if it does go ahead, we don't foresee it reaching either of the government's stated goals, which are to reduce spending and to get disabled people into work. It's in fact going to push spending, and we can talk about this more, over to other struggling parts of government, of public spending, and instead is actually going to leave many disabled people farther from work than they once were, maybe even pushing some out of work. And regardless, we've seen the numbers on how many hundreds of thousands of people this is going to push into poverty. PIP in particular is meant to fill the gap in public services to account for the extra cost of being disabled. Unfortunately, in the unequal society we live in, the inaccessible society, there are a lot of costs to being disabled, and it's meant to fill that gap. So taking it away is going to be quite dire for very many people.
I certainly don't think this is the strongest critique of the policy, but it's unique. So I suppose I want to push on this. You say that this would actually cost the government money, because I suppose the way I was looking at this is that it would save the government money, but it would also push people into poverty, and you can decide which is your priority. But you were saying that this would not actually save the government any money. Could you talk about that?
No, I mean, there are quite a few projections on this. The one I'll talk about is the one from the Disability Policy Centre, which projects £1.2 billion in cost to the NHS and social care services. And in fact, they noted that for every pound that someone loses in benefits, so that the government is saving in spending, if a council has to step in to cover the shortfall, it's going to be about £1.50 additional impact. So these so-called savings are in some ways going to cost more than they save, but just pushed to other budgets. I've heard some people saying it's borrowing from Peter to pay Paul rather than actually creating savings.
What's the mechanism there? Just sort of explain how it happens that if you take away PIP from people, that ends up costing the NHS or social care more money. How does that work?
Absolutely. So a lot of people use PIP to pay for, say, a piece of assistive technology, a wheelchair, a mobility device, a piece of digital tech that helps them to work or to live. And if they can't get that using this extra money they're getting in their pocket, they're going to go to their council. They're going to go to wheelchair services. They're going to go to the NHS. A lot of people also use PIP to cover care, to pay for a carer to come in, help you do some meal prep, help you to the bathroom, help you get dressed. And if you can't pay for that with your PIP, you're going to apply for adult social care through your council. So this was actually PIP and other similar benefits are a really cheap way to get these services covered, to fill this gap. And when you take it away, you're instead pushing that need, because that need doesn't disappear. People don't become less disabled. It's instead, they're going to be applying for the services elsewhere. And we already know that these systems are really bureaucratically complex. You can't just suddenly hire a new carer through your council. You have to go through 9 months of assessments, of being assessed by different people, of them creating a care package, and on and on and on, which is a system that does cost far more than, say, me just going out and being able to pay for someone to help me get dressed and get to work.
That's really interesting. That does make lots of sense. The government's line has been that this is to help disabled people because they want to get people into work. The claim, I suppose, is that people are worried that I've always been a bit confused about the claim because PIP is not an out of work benefit, but the only way I can make this make sense is they think that there are people who are on PIP who don't want to go back to work because if they go back to work, they risk losing their PIP. And so to remove that disincentive to going to work, they should take PIP away to begin with. Is that am I relaying their logic correctly? And if so, what's your response to it?
As you say, it's a very flawed logic because going, say, back to work or entering work for the first time would not result in your PIP being taken away. PIP is done as a result of an assessment of your disability needs. So how mobile are you? What mobility needs do you need? How well can you, say, make yourself a meal independently? Do you need some assistance? Do you need a lot of assistance? Can you not do it at all? And things like that that are not dependent on someone being in or out of work. And I think it's really interesting. I'll read, for instance, some of the changes that are coming in. So needing help to wash your hair or your body below the waist would not meet the new threshold, while needing help to wash your upper body would. Needing help to go to the lavatory is above the threshold, but needing reminding to go would fall below it. Needing prompting to engage with other people face to face would not meet the new test. Needing help to do so would. So these are really arbitrary and strange differences that are being introduced. And I think to a lot of people, it sounds really absurd because it is. So you're telling people, many of whom are working disabled people, that needing to wash below their waist is not a necessity. To me, if you or I started going to work, not being fully washed, I think we'd end up out of work quite soon. So it really doesn't make sense, this link between having or not having PIP and being or not being able to work. In fact, many disabled people use PIP to do the things they need to get to work, such as paying for a taxi if you live in an area that does not have an accessible train station or tube station, which, as we know, throughout the UK, we have real entrenched issues with accessible transport. In London, even, only 1/3 of tube stations are accessible. So if suddenly you lose the funding to be able to commute to work, that's very close to, for many people, losing their job. And that absence of support is really a logical gap in the government's plans here.
The government's line and why they say this is necessary, or at least some reform, even if not this reform is necessary, is because the bill for people who are adults who need some sort of disability benefit, so either PIP or incapacity benefit, that has been going up dramatically in recent years. What's your response to that? Do you think that to the extent to which the costs of these benefits have gone up, that just reflects an underlying increase in disability, or is it more people who should have been receiving it 5 years ago are receiving it now, so it's sort of positive in that extent? What's your analysis of that, I suppose, that trajectory of disability spending?
It's really complicated. And the first thing I'll say, as a researcher myself, is that we need more research into it because we're really not exactly sure what's going on here. Part of it is that people have, over time, been shifted from other benefits to PIP. So, for instance, from DLA, when you turn a certain age, you also move over to PIP. And we've never seen the government actually answer the question of how many of these thousands of new claims per day, per month that we're seeing are actually just the classic people aging out of one program and into another. We've never gotten them to answer that. Likewise, you are seeing, as you say, increased awareness of different conditions, especially mental health and learning disability related, and an increase of available supports for those. So say if you had a certain learning disability 20 years ago and you weren't able to get a job, people were discriminating against you, or you didn't have the tools needed to be able to be an employee in a lot of settings, there was really nothing much to do. Over the last few decades now, we've had a lot of increases in assistive technology, in better awareness, in the tools that can help you succeed. Unfortunately, those tools cost money. And with them, people seeking out ways to get those tools through benefits, through programs, etc. So it isn't necessarily this story of overdiagnosis and people just seeking out more ways to have financial security, well, that could certainly play into it. It's things like demographic changes, older populations, increased medical diagnostic techniques, and being able to support people with more disabilities to live for longer. Someone, for instance, with my condition might not have lived to my age 20 years ago. Now we're all around in society, and so we are claiming these benefits.
So if the government were looking to, I suppose, change the disability benefit system, I mean, what do you think they should be looking at?
So there are quite a lot of things that we could be doing to make work more accessible for disabled people. For instance, flexible work is a really big issue. Rachel Charlton Daly has done some good call outs of how when you go to the Find a Job website and you plug in flexible work, remote work, and a disability confident employer, on any given day, you get between like 3 and 15 all across the UK, but that is it. So the jobs that disabled people need are simply not there. And that's where the government should have started. They should have started looking at the private sector and the ways in which they are failing disabled people, the ways in which private sector employers are really unwilling to hire disabled people. And they outright say that, even those who claim to be disability competent. We have a lot of statistics on that are really, really concerning. And even if they are willing, the jobs don't fit the people who are out there to fill them. And so Camden Disability Action, which is a really excellent disabled people's organization based in London, has really responded to these cuts by saying, oh yeah, you want disabled people to work? Fine, give us jobs. Give every disabled person a job that they can work in, a job that is accessible to them. And you immediately see kind of how ridiculous that expectation is in a system where work is so inflexible, is so inaccessible, when there is so much stigma. And, you know, over the course of talking about this issue a lot over the last few months, I have heard uncountable stories about people coming to me and saying, yeah, I had this excellent job offer. I was really excited to start. And then I told them I needed disabled parking, and it was rescinded. And there was nothing I could do. You know, could I have maybe sued them? Maybe, but it would have been a he said, she said situation. And at the end of the day, I still lost that job. They gave it to someone else. They weren't going to hire me if I won the lawsuit. So just time and time again, of disabled people either having their offers rescinded when they out themselves as having access needs, or once they're in the job, having those access needs denied, and because of that, not being able to stay in work. And there's the Access to Work program, which is supposed to fill that gap. But, and perhaps you've seen this, the waiting list is, for me, I'm currently on the waiting list, have been for months, and it's due to be a total of about 40 weeks if it keeps to that. I don't know how many people can, you know, go 40 weeks without their access needs being met. A lot of people will lose out on work because of it. And even once you get into access to work, it is horrifically underfunded. So if this government really was looking to meet this goal of getting disabled people into work, why would you not fully fund the existing programs that are failing to do that? I'm not sure.
Finally, let's end on the politics. There is, I mean, what seems like quite an enormous rebellion against cuts to disability benefits. Do you find that heartening?
I'm really pleasantly surprised. I think I wasn't expecting to see this much of a rebellion. Certainly, we heard of quite a few Labour MPs who were frankly in danger of losing their seats because the number of PIP claimants in their constituencies was actually larger than the margin by which they had won the most recent election. So there was that really, really potential fear of not getting reelected next time. But 123 MPs, which I think where it stands right now is impressive. Now, to my understanding, we still have to wait to see if this amendment they've put forward that would kill the bill would be chosen. If not, we have to see how the votes go and whether this contingent, along with the Tories, vote against the bill, to see how it goes. But it's a really striking rebellion.
New York City is on track to have a socialist mayor. That's after Zohran Mamdani, a 33-year-old Democratic socialist, won the Democratic primary for November's mayoral election. And his victory speech was full of his now trademark charm.
Thank you, my friends. Tonight, we made history. In the words of Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it is done. My friends, we have done it. I will be your Democratic nominee for the mayor of New York City.
Mamdani's campaign focused on New York's growing affordability crisis, with ordinary New Yorkers increasingly priced out of rents, groceries, and access to amenities. He's pledged city-owned grocery co-ops with price controls, rent freezes in certain buildings, and free bus travel in the city. That focus on tackling the economic woes of ordinary New Yorkers appears to have paid off. With 93% of the votes counted, Mamdani was the clear winner, and with nearly 44% of New York Democrats voting for him. Significantly behind was his main rival, the disgraced former New York governor, Andrew Cuomo. In his concession speech, Cuomo was pretty gracious.
Tonight was not our night. Tonight was Assemblyman Mamdani's night, and he put together a great campaign, and he touched young people and inspired them and moved them and got them to come out and vote. And he really ran a highly impactful campaign. I called him, I congratulated him, I applaud him sincerely for his effort, and let's give him a round of applause and thank him for his campaign.
Now, that was distinctly different in tone from how Mamdani's political and media opponents had attacked him in the build-up to this primary, and because it wasn't Mamdani's economic or social policies that were in the crosshairs, but rather his views on Palestine. In the past, Mamdani had called to globalize the Intifada, as well as chanted from the river to the sea. And that support for Palestine was used as an attack line during his entire campaign. Take a look.
Supporting these democratic socialist candidates that released a wave of anti-Semitism throughout our city, which has been toxic.
There's a leading mayoral candidate in New York right now, who refuses to condemn the phrase, globalize the Intifada. That is sickening that this is in our political system.
You're currently the only candidate using the term genocide to describe what's going on in the war between Israel and Hamas. You realize a lot of people stop listening when you use a hot-button term like that.
Do you support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state?
I support Israel's right to exist as a state with equal rights. I believe that every state...
Why not as a Jewish state?
Because I'm not comfortable supporting any state that has a hierarchy of citizenship on the basis of religion or anything else.
Because of Mamdani's support for Palestinians in Gaza, he was forced to repeatedly confront accusations of anti-Semitism, and while being asked more about Israel than any other candidate in the race. Both of the city's major newspapers, the New York Times and the New York Post, each from the opposite side of the political spectrum, condemned his candidacy. But Mamdani was incredibly good at addressing the criticisms, including this week, with fellow candidate Brad Landre on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room, is that there are many people in New York, even people who would support your candidacy otherwise, who don't want to support you because of the Jewish community's fear of the true and rising anti-Semitism, not only around the world, but in this country and shamefully in New York, which is the largest Jewish population of any city other than Tel Aviv in the whole world. And they are worried, they're very upset by some of the things that you've said in the past. And they are afraid that your mayorship would actually lead to increased anti-Semitism, that they believe that that would be more dangerous for them. What do you say to those New Yorkers who are afraid that you wouldn't be their mayor, that you wouldn't protect them?
I know where that fear is coming from. It's a fear that is based upon the horrific attacks we've seen in Washington, D.C., in Boulder, Colorado. It's
all the way from Jews will not replace us to today.
And it's a fear that I hear also from New Yorkers themselves. Just a few days after the horrific war crime of October 7th, a friend of mine told me about how he went to his synagogue for Shabbat services, and he heard the door open behind him, and a tremor went up his spine as he turned around, not knowing who was there and what they meant for him. I spoke to a Jewish man in Williamsburg just months ago who told me that the door he left unlocked for decades is now one that he locks. And ultimately, this is because we're seeing a crisis of anti-Semitism.
Mamdani's Muslim background was also cited by some as a reason not to vote for him in a city with a large Jewish population. On his show, Colbert gave him a chance to address those claims.
You'd be the first Muslim mayor of New York. How do you think you could build a bridge of understanding between the significant Muslim population here in the city and the significant Jewish population here in the city? How do you think you could lower tension?
I think by foregrounding that humanity. And in many ways, that's the most New York City thing we can do, because for so many of us who've grown up in this city, difference is something that we celebrate. It's something that we know is actually a part of the fabric of this place that we call home. And many years ago, I was the campaign manager of a Jewish candidate for state senate, and I took him to a mosque in Bay Ridge. And after he gave his speech at Friday prayers, an older Palestinian man came over to him, and he looked at him and he said, "Cousins." And I think that there is this possibility of building a shared life in our city, because ultimately that is the story of New York City. It's a shared life of people from across the world, and it's one that we know, even in the language of the hostage families themselves, everyone for everyone. We are tied together as one.
Despite facing pretty intense scrutiny for his positions on Palestine and without the support of most of the Democratic establishment, nor Andrew Cuomo's $25 million super PAC and billionaire backers, Mamdani has won the race. But for now, while the New York left is celebrating his win, there are plenty of people unhappy that Mamdani even made it this far. Here's the view of the Murdoch-owned New York Post. NYC SOS reads the headline, and the paper asks, who will save city after radical socialist batters Cuomo in Dem mayoral primary? Meanwhile, radical Zionist movement Betar Worldwide urged all Jews to evacuate NYC while retweeting a post from the Republican Jewish Coalition calling on Jewish people to evacuate the city immediately. I'm joined now by Waleed Shahid, a Democratic strategist. Welcome back to the show. Great to have you on. Let's begin with a general question. How significant was this win?
Yeah, this is one of the biggest political upsets in American history. They're bigger than AOC defeating Joe Crowley in 2018. And, the only comparable thing that I could imagine is Barack Obama beating Hillary Clinton. But, Barack Obama was backed by significantly more forces in the Democratic Party than Zohran Mamdani. I mean, this is a huge victory for the left, for Muslim Americans, for Jewish Americans who have been protesting in the streets for in some cases decades, but most recently in the past year, to stop the Israeli assault on Gaza. And last night, this was just, feelings of jubilation, hope, a vision for the future for both, the Democratic Party and New York City. People are incredibly proud of the discipline and rigor and just the grit of Zohran's campaign and the Democratic Socialists of America and many of the local organizations, Muslim, Jewish, Arab, who supported this campaign against all odds and against over $25 million of super PAC spending from all the way from Palantir to Michael Bloomberg to Trump's donors, Bill Ackman, DoorDash, Uber. This was a major defeat of the Democratic Party establishment and of its aligned donors, and also of a lot of the Trump donors who donate to both corporate conservative Democrats and to Republicans.
But just help us get our expectations in order. So he's won the primary to become New York mayor, but the Democratic candidate is presumably the favorite to win. So should we assume that Mamdani will become New York mayor, or do you think there are going to be, presumably there'll be lots of money piling in to try and stop that happening? How are you interpreting this primary win?
People were very surprised by the tone of Andrew Cuomo's concession speech. It's the most gracious thing I think he's ever done in his political career. His tone was extremely conciliatory. Many of us were afraid that Andrew Cuomo would do as he pledged to do in the primary, is that if he didn't win the Democratic primary, he would run as an independent in the general election. And if that were the case, many people in the Democratic Party establishment might have thrown their support behind him to defeat, a left-wing populist candidate like Zohran Mamdani. It doesn't seem like that's going to be the case anymore, given Cuomo's tone. Many members of the Democratic Party political establishment, from Hakeem Jeffries to Chuck Schumer to Kathy Hochul, have also, as of this morning, said positive, nice things about Zohran. So that would mean the race would primarily be between Zohran Mamdani and now independent, corruption scandal ridden Mayor Eric Adams. Eric Adams is very unpopular in the city. Maybe he could pull a rabbit out of a hat and get, major support from corporate donors, pro-Israel donors, things like this. But it seems very unlikely that will happen at this point. The more likely scenario is Zohran will be the next mayor as of January next year.
I mean, I don't in any way want to say this to underplay Zohran Mamdani's incredible achievement here, but did he get slightly lucky with his opponents? Why the hell did the Democratic establishment all rally behind Andrew Cuomo as the guy that they thought could win? This is a guy who had to resign sort of in disgrace as the governor of New York for sexual harassment, for allegations of sexual harassment, which he of course denies. And you had this sort of very embarrassing series of Democratic politicians who had called for his resignation just 3 years ago and were now saying he was the right guy to lead New York City. What was the Democratic establishment thinking?
Yeah, I don't want to take this victory away from Zohran. This is the Cuomo thing is a double-edged sword. Like, on the one hand, one of the hardest things to do in American politics is to be a candidate without any name recognition, meaning that voters literally have never heard of you before, because we don't vote in primaries, we don't vote based on parties, we vote based on individuals. And so Zohran started with 1% name recognition, and Cuomo started with nearly 100% name recognition. And so he was strong in some regards, meaning that everyone knew who he was. He had almost every single major labor union in New York City backed him. Most of the elected officials backed Andrew Cuomo. Most of the Democratic Party donors and also, corporate Republican donors backed him. It was not, everything in hindsight seems like it was easy and a disaster, but that's, nowhere. And Zohran really picked up speed in the last 3 weeks. And Cuomo was also virtually endorsed by the New York Times editorial board in the city. So, the reason why the kind of corporate conservative wing of the Democratic Party were not able to field another candidate besides Andrew Cuomo is because of Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo is the closest thing that Democrats have to Donald Trump in their party. He is a vindictive, the closest you can get to anything like an authoritarian. People refer to him in the New York City press as a sociopath, very much like a machine, strongman type. And he has crushed anyone from emerging in the Democratic Party to, even within his own ideological lane, to emerge as a potential successor or someone who could potentially run in that lane that's similar politics to him. He has not allowed, no dissent, no successors. It is about him, ultimately. He's narcissistic, and ultimately for his wing of the party or his ideological faction, he likely committed his own unforced error here by running. But ultimately, even before ideology, politics is about Andrew Cuomo, for Andrew Cuomo.
Let's talk about the role Palestine played in this race, because, what's remarkable about Zohran Mamdani's win is not just that he was someone who, opposed the genocide in Gaza and called it a genocide, which is remarkable in and of itself for someone to win in the United States. But, I mean, his statements, I don't know if he describes himself as an anti-Zionist, but sort of when he answered the question, should Israel be a Jewish state? And he said it should, like all states, I think it should be a state where citizens have equal rights, whatever their ethnicity or background. Those are positions which, I mean, they shouldn't be radical, but I assumed they were radical when it comes to sort of American, sort of the center of gravity when it comes to American political discourse, let's say. So how surprising is it that someone with those positions could win in New York City, which I suppose is not only the center of American capital, but also the city, I think, outside of Israel with the largest Jewish population in the world?
Yeah, there was a deliberate effort by Zohran Mamdani's opponents and also in the New York City political and media establishment to paint Zohran as a anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, extreme Muslim candidate, and to also divide the very real, bonds of solidarity in the city between progressive Jews and progressive Muslims, progressive Arabs, who have been working in electoral politics and community organizing in the city for many years, including people like Brad Lander, the third place candidate who told his voters to rank Zohran Mamdani number 2. Brad Lander is one of the highest, is a Jewish elected official with one of the highest positions in New York City. He's the comptroller, which is essentially like the treasurer or CFO of New York City. And they don't agree on every single point related to Israel-Palestine. But I think forging that bond is so rare in American politics for a Jewish and a Muslim candidate to appear on stage together and support each other with a politics that is more or less, on the same page. A lot of people today in the Democratic Party establishment are saying that, Zohran's candidacy wasn't really about policy or ideology or Palestine even. It was about, he was really good at TikTok. He went on all the podcasts. He represented a young face against an old guard. And I frankly think that is a lot of cope from the Democratic establishment to not grapple with what anyone who was paying attention to that race knows that, those things certainly helped, but they were in service of a larger political project and political vision. And Zohran would probably be the first one to tell you that you cannot tell the story of this campaign without acknowledging that Zohran unleashed a kind of sleeping giant in New York City in the Democratic Party, which has been bottled, which is fierce opposition to U.S. support and the Democratic Party support for Israel's war crimes in Gaza. That has not been able to find a political expression or political vehicle in the Democratic Party, even though most Democrats agree with that position. And I think because of Zohran's history on that issue, his convictions on this issue, and his compelling common sense, humanity-based answers on some of the questions he gets about those issues, that really galvanized his core constituency of volunteers that enabled him to get to where he was today, rather than do what Democrats typically do on the issue, which is say nothing, tiptoe around it, or parrot, AIPAC or even Netanyahu's talking points. And so I think a lot about the 2017 airport protests also, when Donald Trump did the Muslim ban in New York City. Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and many Jewish Americans, went to airports. People shut down their bodegas. Many bodegas or corner stores or delis in the city are owned by Arab Americans. People shut down their stores to go protest during the initiation of the Muslim ban by Trump. And those people were carrying around American flags saying no hate, no fear, no ban. And that particular sentiment that was expressed in 2017 against the Muslim ban, the Democratic Party has worked really hard to exclude that sentiment from being expressed anywhere near formal politics. And while talking a lot of game about how the party is for multiracial democracy while Donald Trump is against it, Zohran kind of unleashed the contradictions around that and kind of enabled it to be weaved together into a real fabric of what solidarity and common humanity might look like across difference. And I think that a lot of people really valued that approach to politics, which is refreshing.
And I suppose when he was controlling the narrative, so sort of in his literature, in his videos, Zohran Mamdani was very, very focused on the cost of living. I think sort of when it was his choice, what he spoke about, that's all he ever spoke about. Which I think is important, actually, though. If he was asked about a different thing, he was willing to answer the question. He wasn't like, well, I'm not here to talk about Palestine. I'm here to talk. He was like, I will answer your question, but then I'll move on to this. Very, very talented individual. But in terms of the cost of living, I suppose to make sense of whether this can happen, because obviously he's got some very ambitious pledges. So let's talk about a rent freeze and then also free buses. So these are both, I mean, they sound radical. I suppose it's our audience might not really understand how New York housing works, because you have rent controls, but on only some flats, and the mayor gets to decide whether or not the rent increases. It's a bit confusing for us. So if you could sort of explain how some of these ambitious policies would play out in practice, that would be helpful.
Yeah, my understanding is that the rent stabilization or rent freezing, rent control is controlled by the Rent Guidelines Board, whose members are appointed by the mayor, and they have the power to freeze the rents. I don't know what it's like in London or in the UK, but there was more rent stabilization and rent control in the 60s and 70s than there is today. Many of those rent-controlled apartments have increasingly gone out of rent control due to loopholes that landlords have imposed and the weakening of strong housing policy in the city. It won't be an easy walk in the park. Like, this will be a real fight with landlords in this city around and getting that through. There'll be a whole media battle around it. They will probably trot out small mom and pop individual landlords to make their case against rent freezing. On some of the other pieces like grocery stores or free buses, there are some cities in the U.S. that are in Canada that already have free bus programs. Actually, Mayor Bill de Blasio, who was the last progressive mayor of New York City, it's the parallel here is when Bill de Blasio was running for mayor, he campaigned on universal pre-K, and he said he would pay for it through a millionaire's tax. And the New York Times editorial board at the time said that they couldn't endorse Bill de Blasio because his policies were so outlandish and were never going to happen. One of the things about universal pre-K was that it needed to be funded by Albany, the state capital of New York, and Andrew Cuomo was the governor at the time, and Andrew Cuomo hated Bill de Blasio, and Andrew Cuomo didn't want to tax his own millionaire and billionaire donors to pay for the universal pre-K program. But Bill de Blasio put together a major community, labor union, political apparatus to run an entire campaign in the public around shaming Andrew Cuomo as the main blocker to New Yorkers having access to universal pre-K. And eventually Andrew Cuomo relented, and New York City had one of the first universal pre-K programs in the country that now Mamdani wants to increase. So there are models for this. And I wouldn't say that, on some of these things, it'll happen. These things can happen on day one. Like, these are going to be real struggles and fights to get done against some of the most powerful people in New York City, let alone America, let alone the world. But I think that if Zohran can put together the coalition and the inside-outside game that even someone like Bill de Blasio put together for universal pre-K, it's possible. You just have to fight for it.
Just for our British audience, pre-K is pre-kindergarten, so sort of childcare before you're of age to go to kindergarten or nursery in our country. Waleed Shahid, thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating stuff. Congratulations to the American left. You've had a great 24 hours. You've earned it.
Yeah, is this what happiness feels like? We're feeling good.
Yeah. Don't rush through it. Let yourself dwell in it for a while, I think. But yeah, thank you. Great, always great to get you on the show.
Take care. Bye.
Let's wrap up there. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to my free guests today. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.